So this is one of a series of sermons on Exodus, and previously we've looked at the situation of the Israelites and the Hebrews in Egypt under slavery and Pharaoh's efforts to kill baby boys there. So Moses was born, and not only did he survive, but he was adopted and taken into the royal palace by the daughter of Pharaoh. And in today's passage, and in fact, it's interesting that there are two passages in Scripture, and I think the first one in Acts, we can see that Stephen, he was reading the same text that we have in way back in Exodus. So this shows that it's pretty accurate, and the fact that it appears 2 or 3 times in Scripture is maybe it's something important. Anyways, in today's passage, God, like Moses, identifies with and remembers his people. Not that God ever forgot his people, and I'll talk about remembering a little bit later. God sees and takes notice of their sufferings and trouble, like Moses. He hears their cries and prayers, and he takes action. And that action, as Moses found out, is not a quick fix. But in these events, God is preparing Moses for a greater mission. So although you may not be suffering in slavery, you may be suffering in some way, and you might be facing challenges, or you might be feeling forgotten by God. But we can see from this passage that that God sees you and he remembers you, and he hears your prayers, and he will take action, even if the answer is not yet visible. And notice that the Israelites, for them in slavery, it didn't appear that God's action was very visible yet, but he was working in preparing Moses. So, God has you in mind, and your efforts, whatever they are and however small they might be, can contribute to his bigger mission of establishing his kingdom. Just as Moses' efforts in these individual incidents in this passage, they contributed in the overall plan that God had, although God had a much bigger plan that Moses maybe didn't realize at the time exactly how that would work out. So today's passage can be divided into 4 different parts. There are 3 different events or incidents, and these incidents where Moses intervenes on behalf of the poor or the victim or the person that's being persecuted or whatever. And then there's the 4th part where the Israelites cry out and God responds. So the 3 interventions, they reveal something about Moses' character and his commitment to justice. So it's not just making a point about Moses being a murderer, but in that it's showing that he identifies with his people, and he's compassionate and standing up for the person who is a victim and weak. So the first incident is in verse 11 and 12. That's the killing of the Egyptian overseer or oppressor. And the second part is verse 11 or 13 through 14, where he intervenes in a fight between 2 Hebrews, and he discovers that he's been seen in the previous incident. And the third section is 15 to 22, where Moses rescues Royal's daughters, and he settles in Midian. So first of all, Moses flees to Midian and rescues Reuel's daughters at the well. And then verses 18 and 19, there's the report of that rescue and Reuel's hospitality to Moses. And then Moses, in verses 21 and 22, settles in and marries Zipporah and has a son, Gershom. And verses 23 to 25, the 4th part, are about the Israelites crying out to God and God hearing, remembering, seeing, and knowing them. So there are certain themes in Exodus. Just to give you a little more context, one of those themes is God's deliverance and his redemption of his people out of slavery in Egypt. A second theme is his remembrance. God remembers and he fulfills his promises that were given in the covenants, to those promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he promised in those to multiply them and make a great nation out of them. And in in Exodus, he kind of also renews that covenant and at Mount Sinai, and then later on, which God provides rules of conduct and this is Exodus is the place where we have the Ten Commandments, and goes on to also provide a place of worship, a sanctuary. In other words, the tabernacle, and God reveals and shows the Israelites how to worship and have fellowship with him. So those are kind of the broad kind of background. And in this particular passage, we see that God is preparing Moses to be his agent of deliverance, which is one of the themes. And he also, as mentioned here, that he remembers his covenant, which is another part of the themes of Exodus. And he's actively working behind the scenes to fulfill his promises. So we have previously noted that there were 5 women whose courage and compassion made it possible for Moses to survive, and in God's providence, that is. So there were 2 midwives, the leading midwives, who refused to follow Pharaoh. They resisted his effort to kill Hebrew boys. And then the 3rd and 4th women who supported God's plan were Moses' mother, Jochebed, who hid him for 3 months, and his sister, who watched over him. So his sister Miriam watched over him as he was in the basket and negotiated with Pharaoh's daughter. So Pharaoh's daughter was the 5th woman who is involved, and she showed compassion and rescued baby Moses in spite of her father's command to kill the babies of the Hebrews. So in this passage, Moses begins as a prince, and he's living in a rich urban palace wherever the royal residences happened to be at that time of the Pharaoh of Egypt. He was receiving his education, and he had all the privileges of some of the highest class people in Egypt. At the end, he ends up as a shepherd in the relatively kind of barren and rural countryside of Midian. This would sort of be like growing up in Buckingham Palace in England. And I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but Sarah and I toured it one time a few years ago, and it's pretty luxurious, pretty fancy. And probably the palaces in Egypt were also very luxurious and fancy with all the wealth of Egypt. And so in a sense, Moses's journey in this particular passage is going like from someplace like Buckingham Palace to maybe being a shepherd in Iceland or something. The only difference is there's not much ice in Midian. Midian is a hot and desert and desolate place, kind of, but he ended up being a shepherd. And he, in chapter 3, we read that he became a shepherd for his father-in-law in this kind of hostile environment. So, you know, in one sense, there's some foreshadowing of even the Christ, as we kind of think of Philippians 2, where Christ was in heavenly realms with, he was with King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He was had great privileges, which he gave up and became incarnate and became a baby on earth. He too was in a situation where the ruler was trying to kill babies. Herod was trying to kill the babies of Bethlehem. So you can see some parallels as you read about the life of Moses between Moses and Christ. There are probably others that we could mention, but that's just a start. So when you look at the education and the early life of Moses, you wonder, I mean, when did this take place? And I would suggest that it was, about 1500 or 1300 BC, one or the other, depending on which time period you think the Exodus took place in. And so that would be about 3,300 or 3,500 years ago. There's also another passage in the New Testament that covers kind of this part of Hebrews, and it's in that famous chapter on faith. And remember in Hebrews 11:1, it says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." And it goes on later in the chapter after mentioning different heroes of the faith. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. And by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. And he saw perhaps how God could be at work. So Acts 7 says that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. And most likely he had a special tutor and studied one or more of the palaces. This is not as unusual as you might think. James Hoffmeyer, in his book Israel in Egypt, says that the Pharaoh, Thutmose III, initiated the practice of bringing the princes of subject kings of Western Asia to Egypt to be trained in Egyptian ways. He wasn't doing that totally for his own, out of, kind of unselfishness, but he was hoping to train them so that when their fathers died, they could be sent back as vassal kings and take over for their, the areas where Egypt ruled. But in any case, the idea is that non-Egyptians were studying in the Egyptian court at this time. And so Moses got a very good education. He studied, of course, writing, and he may have even studied not only the Egyptian writing, hieroglyphs, but also some of the languages of Canaan, because there were people in the court who knew those languages. One other thing that he might have studied when he was there or picked up from the Egyptian school texts, which they tended to convey a contempt of manual labor. And so that was a subject that, maybe Moses had to humbly unlearn as he became a shepherd. Even if the Egyptian education was necessary preparation, it's only God's instruction and power and deeds that truly prepare Moses for his role as leader. And so God was still working in his life to prepare him in different ways to be a leader and deliverer of the people. So one other interesting thing that I found when I was reading about this part of Moses' life was, he lived in a palace, and there were probably several royal residences, and various biblical references indicate that the Pharaoh and Moses were at certain times, they were at a palace that was near the Nile River, and also it was near where the Israelites were living and working, and they were working near Ramses in the Delta region. And so what's interesting is the archaeologists during the 1990s, that was a time when they first discovered an enormous royal compound that was on the eastern branch of the Nile River, and this was used during this period of the 18th dynasty, which is 1500 to 1300 BC. So this compound consisted of a huge fortress and a huge palace. And so this is something that is in the Archaeological Study Bible. And so this confirms that there was a palace complex on the Nile at that time and at that place where Moses would have been living. And so when he came out to see the Israelite people, he didn't have to travel halfway across the country. He was in that same region where they were, most likely. So in this first part, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them in their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, and he, looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Esau Macaulay refers to this passage in his book, Reading While Black, an African-American biblical interpretation as an exercise in hope. So this is a good book. I kind of recommend this. It was a kind of a prize-winning book a couple years ago. Esau Macaulay, Reading While Black. And so he actually refers to this passage, and he says, Moses in his younger days sees the oppression of his fellow Israelites and responds by killing the Egyptian. We know that Moses had properly diagnosed the problem of Israel's slavery, but his solution was ill-conceived. And later, God in his own time does bring lasting liberation to his people and links it to proper worship and the transformation of the nation. So we're not, often in the Bible, we might look for positive examples to follow of God's heroes and God's but This is one of those examples that we shouldn't follow, I'm sure. And the Bible's not telling us to go out and murder somebody, but just, to fight for justice that way. But anyways, just want to, point out, since February is Black History Month, there's a bit of a parallel between these early efforts to free individual slaves, both in Boston and in Egypt, and the parallel between later struggle to deliver a whole people from slavery in America and Egypt. So Boston has a history of involvement with slavery from the 1600s and 1700s, both in trade relations between the West Indies and Europe and Boston, and also, the personal enslavement of people, slave ownership in Boston. So during that period, Boston was definitely involved, even though there were not big plantations here in Boston. The city was very much involved in the slave trade and in slavery. But in the 1800s, however, Boston became known as an active center of abolitionism. And some of the churches were very much involved. The First African Baptist Church, which is the oldest Black Baptist church in the whole church building in the whole country, they were very much involved. 12th Baptist Church, which was at that time led by Leonard Grimes, was also very much involved in the anti-slavery movement, and they paid for the freedom of some slaves. And the predecessor of Union Methodist Church, which is a Black Methodist church, that church is also involved. And one of its members, David Walker, wrote a famous piece called Walker's Appeal, which was very influential. And also there were churches like Park Street Church. Reverend Beecher was an anti-slavery activist as well. His sister wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Tremont Temple was also an anti-slavery church. So anyways, Boston, just saying that Boston churches were involved a lot of times in the abolition movement and in freeing individual slaves, for example. So like Moses in Exodus 2, they tried to intervene in the cases of individuals who were victims of slavery, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. That was in 1850. In Boston, this was a courageous effort to save individuals that were being pursued by slave catchers. For example, Shadrach Minkins, who was an escaped slave, worked in Boston's Cornhill Coffee House, and he was the first New England slave arrested by the Fugitive Slave Law. So anti-slavery activists in Boston, they rescued him in the Boston courthouse, and they secretly whisked him away through the Underground Railroad up through New Hampshire and Vermont, and eventually I think he was able to get on the Overground Railroad and make his way to freedom in Montreal, where he set up some businesses and lived a happy and free life after that. So that's just one example of efforts to rescue individual slaves in Boston. And not every effort was successful, but many people were rescued, and the churches mentioned were gathering places for some of the famous abolitionists who spoke in Boston. They spoke out against slavery, and they used the churches as a place to speak out for anti-slavery. But in Egypt, the deliverance of a whole people out of slavery was going to take a bigger plan, which God was already working on in the process of preserving and preparing Moses as his agent of deliverance. And although Moses, maybe he had good intentions, but it was kind of an ill-conceived effort to, free his fellow Hebrew from oppression. And what he was doing when he killed the Egyptian was in kind of secret. He looked this way and that way, and he made sure, he thought he made sure that he was doing this without anybody noticing. He intended it to be secret. But what God had in mind in confronting the system of evil as a whole and the Pharaoh in a very public way would in the end reveal the power and glory of God and the deliverance that the whole world could see and remember. So Exodus 9:16 says, and this is also mentioned in Romans 9:17, but I have raised you, that is the Pharaoh, up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. It is God alone who by signs and wonders and by a mighty hand and outstretched arm saved his people, as we read in Deuteronomy 4:14. So the anti-slavery parallel in Boston, America, was that, the national system of slavery as a whole would need to be confronted. And through that major struggle of the Civil War, steps toward freedom and emancipation could be won. So in both cases, there was a larger picture. It was good that people were trying to rescue individuals or help stand up for people who were individually being oppressed, but there was a much larger plan that God had in mind for Egypt, and also that was the case in Boston and in America as well. It needed a larger plan to address the problem with a bigger system. So Exodus recounts how God remembered his people and his covenant, and he acted not only to deliver people out of physical bondage, but also to instruct them how to live. And God made out of this group of former slaves a new and beloved community and guided them in ways to worship him. So that is kind of a bigger picture that we see out of this little vignette, this little incident. The second incident, the next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. We see in this case, Moses, like other biblical characters, and Christ himself, is rejected because, he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And so this is kind of an example of Moses is trying to do something good. He's trying to intervene and help out the victim, but, he's being rejected by his own people. And, ironically, Moses was later to become the leader and judge over all the Israelites. And we see that in Exodus 18 especially, and as he leads people out through the Exodus. So this particular little event sets the stage for a time when God is going to directly call Moses to become the human deliverer of his people. And he sends him out with signs and the authority to be his agent and leader. And that's mentioned later in Exodus 3 and following. It also becomes clear now that people, including the Pharaoh, know that Moses is on the side of his oppressed people. This rejection that Moses faced kind of foreshadows a number of other times when the Hebrews questioned and tried to reject his leadership, even when they were just before they were crossing the Red Sea. The people were complaining and saying, "We'd rather have stayed in Egypt." And you see that theme throughout the wilderness wanderings, rejection of Moses' leadership. There's also a broader theme of rejection of God and his leaders throughout Scripture. For example, Joseph experiences rejection by his brothers. King David in his later life experienced rejection. And the various prophets, including Jeremiah, experienced rejection. Remember, they put Jeremiah in a well, and they were rejecting his message. And Jesus himself experienced rejection. So John 1:10 and 11 says, "He was in the world and through the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." So you're probably not called to be a judge or a ruler or a prophet, but if you experience rejection in serving God and sharing the gospel, you're not alone. This is something that happened throughout the Bible. There's one other point in this part of the passage. It says, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. So the Pharaoh sought to kill Moses, and I think there was something deeper here than just punishment for breaking the law of murder. But I think, as Peter Enns says, that perhaps his strong reaction may be evidence that he was well aware of Moses' Hebrew birth, or that Moses' act of murder actually betrays his true national allegiance. So the Pharaoh may have been afraid that this was a signal that he was, perhaps going to begin a rebellion. And regardless of whether that was true or not at that point, Moses did feel a call to rescue his people. And Moses, had caused some fear in the Pharaoh, I believe. So the third part is when Moses flees to Midian. It says Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And some shepherds came along and drove them away. But Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. And isn't this another kind of evidence of Moses' character? He's stood up for those who were being, intimidated and harassed, and the weak and the victim, whether it was his own people, whether it was somebody from a different country. So you might ask, where is Midian? What do we know about Midian? Well, Midian, there was a person named Midian who was a younger son of Abram and his wife Keturah, his later wife, which is mentioned in Genesis 25:2. Thus, the Midianites were descendants of Abraham and his son Midian. And they were kind of a semi-nomadic group of tribes who wandered mostly and lived mostly southeast of the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. And the land of Midian itself was in what is now kind of northwestern Saudi Arabia. It was called Arabia in ancient times. And so that would have been on the east part of the arm of the Red Sea. So if you think of the Red Sea as having 2 arms, one was the Gulf of Suez, one was the Gulf of Aqaba. So they lived on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba, east of the Red Sea. And so that's where the land of Midian was that Moses went to. So there was an ancient trade route that went from Egypt to Arabia, and then Moses probably traveled on that, and that went to the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. And since Egypt controlled the Sinai Peninsula and some of those areas in between, that's why Moses had to flee out of the reach of Egypt, so to an area of Midian, which was not controlled by Egypt. And so from the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, he would have taken a trade route south, and he might perhaps have stopped at the first place where there was a good source of water, which was a town called Madian, and it's now called Al-Bad. So Josephus and other ancient writers mention that that Madian was associated with Jethro or Ruel and Moses. And according to the view of Colin Humphreys, he writes a very interesting book about the Exodus. And he thinks this initial Exodus of Moses may have followed the same path that the Exodus of the Israelites took later on, and that the location of Mount Sinai might have even been in the land of Midian. So we don't know for sure. Traditionally, we've seen people have thought of Mount Sinai as being on the Sinai Peninsula in the south, but perhaps it could have been in Midian, perhaps. But in any case, we can see that it was important that Moses learned about this area as he was a shepherd wandering around. He would get to know the lay of the land, and he would get to know desert living, or living in a kind of a harsh environment like that, which would come in handy later on. And as we notice, when he gets to Midian, he's sitting down by a well, and this is one of several well stories. As you remember, in Genesis 24, Abraham, he sent out his servant, and his servant meets Rebekah at a well, and this was a mission to find a wife for Isaac. And so this is where the wife of Isaac was found at a well, and this was an answer to prayer for Abram's servant. And then in Genesis 29, there's another incident of a well. In this case, Jacob comes to a well, and he meets his wife at a well. He meets Rachel at the well, and he waters her sheep. So here's another story. Moses goes to a well, he meets his wife, and helps water the sheep. So it's kind of an interesting pattern. And you notice that it mentions a man named Ruel, and later in chapter 3, you hear about Jethro, and he's considered the father-in-law of Moses. So you wonder, what about these 2 names? So I think Ruel means friend of God, and this might have been a name that was known by certain of the tribes that were Midianite tribes, or perhaps it was a title and the name of his tribal name rather, than just his personal name. But a lot of times in the Bible, you will see his father-in-law called Jethro, so that's kind of the more common name, but he had 2 different names, the same person, but 2 different names. So later in Exodus 18, we learn that Jethro hears what God has done in delivering the Israelites, and he acknowledges God, saying, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods." And then he goes ahead and worships him with sacrifices, and he gives Moses some good advice about delegating, how to delegate the judging, and how to organize the people and leaders. And one of the things to notice about Jethro or Ruel is that he showed hospitality to a refugee and an alien from another country, namely Moses. And so there may be ways we too can show hospitality to a stranger or a refugee and provide some kind of help. You know, it can be valuable just to listen and to read and to know the stories of refugees, because like Moses, even today you'll notice that many are fleeing their country because their lives are threatened, whether they're coming from Venezuela or Haiti or wherever. People are coming because their lives are being threatened. And that's just one other thing about this part, that Moses, as we read in chapter 3, he became a shepherd. And this kind of foreshadows the role of his role later on as shepherd of the people of Israel. And also foreshadows, the fact that David was a shepherd and he was a leader of Israel. And Jesus was figuratively called the Good Shepherd. So there's another kind of connection between Jesus and Moses. So then in the last section, we have the Israelites crying out to God. God hears and remembers. He sees and he knows. It says during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God, and God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. You notice that, and if you were to translate this literally, God's action happens, there's 4 different times, and it uses the word God all 4 times rather than just pronouns. It says in the New American Standard Version, God heard their groaning, God hears. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. I just wanted to make a comment about remembering, and what did remembering mean in the Bible and in regards to God's remembering. To remember someone or something means to think about them, and it doesn't necessarily mean that one is first forgotten. It doesn't mean that God has forgotten them, but they might have thought that he'd forgotten them because he was working in ways they didn't see quite so visibly. Remembering is directing of focus, and it often leads to acting on behalf of or in accordance to the person or thing that has been remembered. God is described as someone who remembers individuals and communities, especially the oppressed, as we read in Psalm 9:12. God instructs Israel to remember that they were once immigrants and slaves in Egypt. We see this in several passages in Deuteronomy, including Deuteronomy 5:15 and 15. So this act of thinking about it will motivate Israel to live for God and to live for the marginalized. And we read in Hebrews 2:6 that we know that God remembers us when he says, "What is man that you remember him?" Knowing that God remembers can lead to great comfort that the injustice that we often see here on earth is not the end of the story, since God remembers both the good to reward with mercy and grace and the bad to judge with justice. We know that at the end of this world, all will be made right because God remembers. So there are many references in which God remembers, and he's called to remember something. And when he does, God goes into action. So when you hear the word remember in the Bible, it's generally very tied into and connected to not only focused attention, but action. So God is acting. So although you may not be suffering in slavery, you may be suffering in some other way, but you're facing challenges of some kind. Just remember, you're not forgotten by God. God sees you and remembers you. He hears your prayers, and he will take action, even if the action is not yet visible. It took 40 years after this time period before God rescued the people of Israel out of slavery. So sometimes the answer may not be visible yet. But nevertheless, God has you in mind, and he's also working. Your efforts, even if they're small, can contribute to his bigger mission to build the kingdom of God. Thank you.